The Vietnamese often describe their country as resembling a bamboo pole supporting a basket of rice on each end. These two baskets are, in fact, the country's two main cultivated areas, the Red River Delta in the north and the Mekong Delta in the south. These are also the areas where Vietnamese culture and civilization began thousands of years ago. A fine, fertile silt has washed downstream these rivers for millions of years. The climate is subtropical in the south of the country and temperate in the north. These natural conditions have produced lush tropical vegetation and very diverse fauna. There are more than 12,000 plant species, only 7,000 of which have been scientifically identified. Vietnam is home to hundreds of species of amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, and fish. Vietnam has so far suffered little industrial pollution. However, the nation's rapid economic and population growth spells environmental trouble ahead. The dramatic increase in noisy, smoke-spewing motorbikes over the past few years should also be taken as a sign of abominations to come. The most serious ecological problem in Vietnam is deforestation. 10 years ago, the country came down to 20% of the original forest cover. The situation today is slightly better, but it's a common fact that each hectare of land stripped of vegetation contributes to flooding, soil erosion, the loss of wildlife habitat, and unpredictable climate changes. The Vietnamese people developed as a distinct ethnic group 2,000 years ago through the fusion of people of Indonesian stock with Viet and Thai immigrants from the north. A strong local culture was formed and could not be absorbed by the Chinese rule, which lasted for 1,000 years and ended in the 10th century. It was not only that this local Vietnamese culture resisted, it even spread southward and assimilated peoples and tribes that lived in those areas. Today's Vietnam, with a population of 80 million people, is the 13th most populous country in the world. Beside ethnic Vietnamese, there are Chinese, Khmers, Chams, and members of over 50 ethnic linguistic groups. For much of its early history, Vietnam was a key port of call on the sea route between China and India. The early Vietnamese learned a great deal from the Chinese, including the use of metal plows, domesticated beasts of burden, and the construction of dikes and irrigation works. These innovations made possible the establishment of a culture based on rice growing, which remains the basis of the Vietnamese way of life to this day. China and India have also both had a decisive influence on spiritual experience and the Vietnamese cultural heritage. The Vietnamese were introduced to Confucianism and Taoism by Chinese scholars who came to Vietnam as administrators and refugees. Indians sailing eastward brought Theravada or Hinayana Buddhism to the Red River Delta, while at the same time Chinese travelers introduced Mahayana Buddhism. The Buddhist monks carried with them scientific and medical knowledge of the civilizations of India and China. As a result, Vietnamese Buddhists soon counted among their own great doctors, botanists, and scholars. However, these three philosophical and religious doctrines, as well as political and social ideals that evolved from them, have been strongly influenced and, in fact, transformed by the local culture and tradition. This process gave rise to the so-called three-tier religion of Vietnam, or Tam Giao, which is practiced by a great majority of the Vietnamese population today. The essential tenet of this philosophy is the widely accepted belief in synergy, not only between man and nature, but also among all forms of being, of matter and life, as well as of all conscious beings. That's why the preservation of synergy between man and nature is an everyday experience, and the nurturing of this synergy is not only the starting point of the Vietnamese culture and tradition, but is also deemed to represent the sine qua non of all human existence. Set deep down the Mekong Delta, the Bat Pagoda represents one of the most unusual Buddhist temples. Here, the ideal and the meaning of human life is deemed to be in personal improvement and in the achievement of nirvana, that is, in the highest revelation, which leads to the freeing from one's personal, physical, mental, and psychological limitations. Built in the Khmer architectural style, this temple is also a monastery in which Hinayana Buddhist practice is being taught. The goal of Hinayana Buddhists is to recreate the triumph of the historical creator of Buddhism, Gautama Buddha. The monks spend their time in meditation, prayers, and the study of Buddhist doctrine. They also find some time for rest and jest, especially the younger monks. This place is very much a favorite among the local population. They call it Chua Doi, the Bat Pagoda. The sanctity of life and the equality of all conscious beings is reflected here by the interesting friendship between monks and bats. The bats have been living for centuries in the orchard of the monastery. They sleep undisturbed during the day. At dusk they go hunting, only to return back to these branches at dawn. They never touch the fruits on these trees. The local population is convinced this is an expression of their gratitude for the monks' hospitality. And this is not the only kind of unusual friendship that is being forged here. When a pig is born with an unusual trait, such as 5 toes, it's brought here to the monastery and lives there peacefully. It's given a name, and when it dies, it's buried and remembered as a dear friend. In In the north of Vietnam, in the mountains of the Red River Delta, we come across the cradle of Mahayana Buddhism and one of the most sacred temples of Vietnam.
What is the name of this place?
Its name in Vietnamese? Nga.
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 Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
No problem.
How do I go to Pagoda?
You can now go for the boat and you go for the boat for 3 kilometers and you go climb the mountain and the 3 kilometers more and you have to see the Birthing Pagoda. The people say the Birthing Pagoda, you know why? Because this on the way you have to see the flower and you come inside the pagoda and you have the smoke for the incense. And people say the Birthing Pagoda.
The river we travel is not only the way to the temple, it's also a rice field and a graveyard which holds memories of those who once lived here and who protected this river.
This is the Vandal Victory and say from people America and fancy they come here, they flame and bomb here and so many Vietnamese they die. And now people Solomon can give for the Vandal Victory and can souvenir.
All matter, animate and inanimate, is deemed to represent one indivisible whole that has its place, meaning and relevance, with no single part having the ability to exist independently of the whole. At the foot of the mountain, preparations for the Tet festival, the Vietnamese New Year, the biggest holiday of the year, are well underway. The way to the monastery leads us up steep cobbled steps, which are now wet and slippery from the long rainy period at this time of the year. With some effort, we climb up to the last resting place. In fact, this is the temple where the last rituals of cleansing, repentance, and paying tribute to the pieties and saints are also performed.
This for the Thiên Chu Pagoda, name for the heaven, a kitchen. They some people Vietnamese they go to the Birthing Pagoda and go back here and they cooking here. They people say for the heaven, a kitchen.
Although Buddhism became the official religion of the country as early as the 12th century, its tenets were practiced mostly by the educated elite and have hardly been accepted among common people whose national tradition went from generation to generation by word of mouth only. The common people were not so interested in the sophisticated philosophies of good state governance as in resolving day-to-day problems with which they were faced.
And the people in the village, they come here, they working for the monk. They follow for the Buddhism and they say here, they sleeping and every day they chant for the incense and water they play here. And food, cooking food and everything.
The ideal of perfect existence is expressed in bodhisattva, the ideal human being which sees the development of virtues and revelation not only as a way of personal improvement, but also as a possibility for serving in its perfection as a guarantee that all conscious beings will be saved. This countless number of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who rule and save in a countless number of worlds, along with Taoist pieties and spiritual beings, is situated on the pantheon of helpers and guardians whose help can be procured by donations and prayers. Vietnamese Buddhism has also adopted different elements of the local culture and tradition, such as mysticism, animism, polytheism, Hindu tantrism, and shaman rituals which are practiced to this day. Finally, we reach the central temple.
Now you go 120 steps and you can see the Burfi Pagoda has a very big cave. Okay.
The perfumed pagoda is in fact a large cave in which the first Chinese Buddhist monk lived many centuries ago. Inscriptions in Chinese written on the stone blocks at the entrance are still there. The cult of ancestor worship represents an expression of not only the belief in spiritual eternity, but also of the pivotal role of the family in the survival of the human race.
People Vietnamese, they come here, they believe, and they can have the money, they burn here, and they give for people in the die and for lucky and everything.
Only 3 times.
Inside this natural temple, even the stalactites and stalagmites have their saintly attributes, names, and meaning. The local population calls them the mountain boy and the mountain girl, and they represent respectively the male and female principles of creation. Being under the watchful eye of so many Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, they are guarantees of life and prosperity for the community. A Buddhist monk may live in isolation in the mountains, as does the monk in this temple, but his main mission is to fulfill the covenant of bodhisattvas, the covenant of eternal compassion, and to help in his spiritual triumph in the freeing of all living beings. As an old Chinese proverb says, a wise man doesn't pile on what he has. When he gives, he gains more than he had. When he gives his last reserves, his supply becomes larger than ever.
Tôi nghe con vườn đá kia còn năn nỉ là đường du con.